So I am Kendra. I am a queer adult living in the Upper Valley. I was a queer teen growing up in a rural part of the Upper Valley about 30 years ago. And I am currently an aunt, a friend, a confidant for lots of kids and teens, some of whom identify somewhere on a spectrum of queerness and gender nonconformity.
All right. That's great to meet you. So the first question that I have for you is, what do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
So this is a great question. And my very first impulse is, how would I know? I'm not a queer or trans kid or youth. Why the heck would you ask me that? So my first answer is, they need you to listen to them so they can tell you what they need. My second answer is, on a deeper, kind of bigger level, everybody needs to feel like who they are and how they are is good and right. And currently, in our culture, that is not the case necessarily for trans or queer kids. There's a lot of narratives that, despite what any one parent might be saying to their kid or any one teacher might say to a kid, there's bigger narratives floating around that being hetero is right, anything else is wrong. And kids absorb that. And I have noticed this recently in some of the kids that I know being really afraid to talk to parents who I, as an adult, think of as really progressive, would never have a problem with their kids being gay or trans or have any issues with it. But those kids have absorbed so many crappy messages about who they are, they're afraid to talk to adults who are generally trusted. So how do we make sure kids know that who they are is good and right? I have some ideas that I think we can talk about later, but on a basic level, we all need to talk more, regardless of if you're straight or gay. As adults, we need to talk more about gayness, queerness, being trans, as if that's a normal and everyday and totally awesome thing to do and be. And that could be a spectrum to getting comfortable with talking about that. But I think that's a baseline thing that folks need. They need to feel like they're okay, acceptable, and they exist.
Yeah, as a recent teen, that definitely resonates with me a lot, because I feel like it was difficult, even though my parents, I knew that they wouldn't have any issue with it, that it was still really difficult because I had internalized a lot of negative things.
Yeah.
So here's another question, and that, since you know a lot of queer kids and teens, is something that you're probably well equipped to answer. What do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
This question makes me want to cry because, like, what does any kid bring? So the kids I know bring humor, they bring intelligence, they bring fun, they bring brattiness, they bring everything that any awesome human being brings to the world. I guess if I was to zoom in a little bit, they bring maybe some questioning of the way things have always gone. They bring adventuresomeness in the way they express their gender. They bring bravery, and they bring a lot of grief. I think, yeah, kids bring all kinds of things, and gay, trans, queer, gender nonconforming kids bring all of that, and then also a need for us to support them and change the way this world works that makes them feel terrible sometimes, or even want to not be in this world. So they bring a need for us to do a lot better as adults.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So what would you say to well-meaning adults in the community who are new to thinking about gender and sexuality and aren't sure what to do or say?
I feel you. It is awkward, right? It is. Anything important is always hard to talk about if it is a little bit different than the narratives that we are all kind of assuming every day. So I feel you. It's awkward and it's hard and it's weird. When we think about how rural queer and trans kids might not see themselves reflected, or they might not even know what queer culture looks like or can be or is, that's also because we as adults in rural areas often don't know either. So I would say if you're well-meaning, it's time for you to do your homework. And this is also something queer kids need. They need to see the adults in their lives taking an interest in looking for, what does queerness even mean? What's the spectrum? What does, I saw one time one person do one thing. Let me actively look for other representations and other ways of thinking about this. I'm going to go to Pride and you don't have to come. I want to go as an adult and figure this out. So I guess I would say for well-meaning adults, you need to take an active interest in educating yourself, and also just having some fun and immersing yourself in something that is new and different to you without requiring your kid to actually be part of that with you. This is for you. This is going to be awesome for you. And it's also going to be really great for your kids or the kids that you work with and are around.
And so this is something of a follow-up. How would you support queer and trans youth who are not out to their parents?
This is very apropos. I know some queer and trans youth, and I've been really thinking about this. So I recently learned that a friend's child is not out to the friends. I learned through someone else, and I immediately was like, oh my gosh, this kid probably is not getting appropriate sex ed at school, and they're not getting supportive adult feedback about relationships, consent, culture, all of those things. So I was like, oh my gosh, what should I do? This kid happens to be over the age of consent, and so I feel comfortable when I see this kid or this teen sharing some appropriate links to sex ed information that includes trans and queer resources in that sex ed, because I'm pretty positive their schools does not. And just some kind of general, there's some zines, great zines out there that are about consent culture, and offering to be an adult who's here to listen and not judge, and who will keep their confidence up to the point that they are in a safe situation. So I think the most important thing is to be somebody safe for them, to consider your responsibilities from your role and position and your relationship with the adults in their lives and their safety with those adults, and you judging what you can offer. But offering resources feels really important to me because the internet is huge and there's so much out there that is not cool at all. And like one Google search could send you places you just really, I don't want to go, let alone I don't want to send a kid or a teen. So finding great resources and making sure kids have access to them is like one small way that I can step up and support teens and kids. And I think particularly for teachers, therapists, those kind of folks, librarians, resource lists seem really great.
All right. Yeah, no, the sex ed thing, it does really resonate with me because sex ed is just, it's not that great in the vast majority of places. There's really no queer sex ed, no discussion of trans people at all, really nothing about consent either. I mean, in the Upper Valley, we have moved past abstinence only, but beyond that, like, there's a lot of important stuff missing.
Yeah, and that I can like kind of now as an adult, I can trace how that impacted me and my own sexuality and my own ability to be in relationships. And I did not have queer elders. I did not have adults who were really good at supporting me. And that I've seen what happens from that. So yeah, I really want to make sure that younger kids now have a better base of support than I did and a lot of people I know did.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple questions we have as well about media representation. The first one being, where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people within TV and film?
I go out of my way to Google best 2020 best queer and trans characters. Then I read those articles. I look at who wrote them, and if they were written by queer and trans people, I'm generally like thumbs up. And then I read those, and then I go watch those films and those TV shows. Like I go out of my way to find that representation. Sometimes it filters into other shows, but often if I don't go looking, often I'll see shows or movies where the lesbian dies at the end every time.
That is so common.
Or the trans person, it's only a story about their torturous coming out and they're very sad and unhappy, and I don't actually get to see them be just like a happy, joyous person in their life. So I go out of my way to look up, Googling positive positive representations of queer and trans people 2020, and then I go from there.
Are there particular characters or films or shows that have stood out to you?
No, to be honest, I haven't seen a lot of movies and shows lately, although I guess I'm watching The Umbrella Academy right now, the second season, and there is a queer character. There's a couple of queer characters in that show. They're kind of good, but I've noticed they're tortured. The show is about tortured people, so maybe that's fair. But also they don't get to have very many like happy, joyous, positive experiences. I did just read a book in which there are multiple queer and trans characters, and the book's not about that, which was really cool. They were just characters who happened to be queer and happened to be trans. So that was cool and exciting.
Do you remember what that book was called?
Yeah, it's the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is just a really fun and awesome trilogy of kind of sci-fi futuristic books anyway.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I would say that the most recent TV show I've seen that shows LGBTQ characters being joyous is Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist.
Oh.
Mo, who lives in the main character's building, is a gender fluid person, and while they do have some struggles, there are also, some really, really positive moments. So I think it's overall a really good story.
Pose. I guess I was watching Pose. I took a pause. Pose is really cool because there's a huge cast full of trans characters, and they just live their lives, and sometimes they're joyous and sometimes they're really, really not joyous. So that's a great show.
So you already did mention one book, but the next question is, where do you see positive representations of queer and trans people in books for kids or youth? If there are any that you know of that actually,
that's really hard. I don't have any off the top of my head for kids. I have been thinking about getting some kids books for my younger nieces and nephews. And again, I was going to Google it and read reviews and find some good ones, because the ones I've seen weren't awesome. I guess what's the one about the penguins?
Yeah.
But the one about the permanently mated homosexual penguins, that was okay. But there also were some that I read that I was like, not cool. I didn't like it all for other reasons. So
sometimes you gotta sift through a lot of those like not so positive representations to really find something that is positive.
Yeah, or something that has both a positive representation of queer or trans folks and aligns with the rest of your values.
Yeah.
That comes up quite often for me.
Oh, yeah.
I really appreciate your pointing out how some of these stories have multiple queer or trans characters, because that's one of the mistakes that I see made so often, is a storyline where there's a queer or trans character and that's what their plot line is about. And it's as if they're the only one in the world. And I think that straight cis adults maybe imagine that that's true, that like, especially trans people, that we're like so rare that we must never run into each other. And that's not really how queer and trans lives tend to work, actually. So depicting queer and trans people who know each other and support each other and are friends with each other is, I think, a really important piece of story to have in the world for young folks.
Yeah, and depicting queer characters and maybe trans characters too, whose relationship to their own gender or their own sexuality changes over time, maybe goes back and forth. Maybe they, has an evolution, but there's no fixed endpoint to that evolution, that I feel like is a lot more realistic. And given the kids that I know, that feels way more real.
So my next question is, what do you wish that you had learned as a kid or as a youth about gender and sexuality that you didn't learn until later?
Holy smokes, anything. Yeah, like that there were options at all, that yeah, that like I mean, it's interesting, I was thinking about this in advance, and my family, one of my mom's best friends was a lesbian, and she was out and proud my whole childhood and married to another woman, and they were big people in my life. I still didn't feel like that was an option for me. So there was a difference between individual people, the one person in my life who I saw doing something different, and the big world of possibility for me, because that big world of possibility was still really bounded by what is okay and right. That was okay for that one person, but it wasn't okay for me or just anyone to do. And so I wish that, yeah, there had been more real ways of backing up my mom saying, I want you to do whatever you want, whatever you do, I'll love you. That was such a nice thing to say, but it wasn't backed up by systems changing or the real messages I was getting from the rest of the world. So I wish I had understood that you can do whatever you want for real, and multiple people will support you, and that can change over time or really quickly, and that's really cool. Also, just like that it's cool to dress and express your gender in really different ways depending on how you feel. That would have been nice to know. I didn't know that until I was an adult. That was not something that was like generally acceptable where I was from.
So this one is definitely that one that you could speak to, considering that you did grow up around here. How might queer and trans youth in rural areas have different needs than in cities? And as a follow-up, how can rural areas be supportive places for queer and trans youth and adults?
Yeah, I was thinking about this specifically because my sister is a therapist who works with, one of her specialties is working with queer and trans folks, youth included. And so in rural areas, there are fewer of everything. So there are fewer therapists, and that means there are way fewer therapists who, in a real sense, can be supportive and helpful to trans and queer youth. A lot of people might say they are, but that might be because they worked with one client one time. That doesn't mean they actually have life experience or a deep understanding of queer culture or the specific issues that kids might be having here. So that's one thing, less resources, less good resources. Another thing, there's still issues, as we're finding out with COVID, around just internet connectivity for folks in rural areas. A lot of kids don't have regular access to the internet, and the internet is the primary way I, as an adult, am getting touchstones of queer culture and keeping connected with like queer friends and family around the country and the world. If you don't have that and you're only connected with the people physically near you, that's a small circle, and it's much less likely to include really awesome role models, mentors, or even friends who also identify as queer or trans. And so one way that I think that could be supported better is really good resource lists in the hands of folks who are working with kids and teens. Resource lists that are vetted by queer and trans people. Because as I said, there's so much out there. It's really easy to find something that's kind of like or like kind of for some people, and include it in your list. It's hard to keep those up to date. Things change fast. But yeah, having resource lists of clinicians who are actually LGBTQIA experienced and supportive, having resource lists of sex ed access, the access to sex ed that is queer and trans affirming and inclusive, ways, meetups, connections to the really great organizations in the state, like Out in the Open, who are constantly putting out content, but a lot of people have no idea that exists. So like just kind of resource direction for folks who, are stuck out. Also, easy things like, could Pride Vermont have a capital campaign where they figure out how to get tablets for folks in communities, like contribute to that in communities and schools, not specifically necessarily for queer kids, but knowing that a lot of queer kids are going to benefit from that, so maybe widening our thought process and our scope creatively about who is supporting what and how, just to think about the downstream effects on queer and trans kids.
I think that those are the main questions that we wanted to ask you today. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us?
I guess just to all the well-meaning adults out there who watch community access TV, I'm so glad that you're tuning into this, and just start somewhere. Don't put it all on your kid. You start your education somewhere, have one conversation with your kid and or another adult. Just you got to start someplace and start building those skills to make sure your kid trusts you and that you're a person who has some knowledge that you could pass to them, in addition to being a caring, nourishing adult, which we all need.